What happens when a country long seen as a quiet middle power suddenly gets the keys to NATO's next fighter jet production line? The answer, dear viewers, explains why a scenario that once sounded impossible is now keeping defense executives in Washington awake at night. For decades, everyone assumed Canada's role was fixed. Buy American jets, follow American doctrine, and accept American control over the supply chain. Tonight, a different possibility is on the table, not as a slogan. As a fully mapped out industrial strategy, Canadian-built Gripens rolling out of Ontario with NATO flags on the tail and billions in long-term contracts flowing north instead of south. And if that sounds far-fetched, the numbers, the jobs, and the export rights we're about to walk through say otherwise. Let's start with the simple question Ottawa can no longer ignore. What happens when defense spending keeps rising, but control over the program keeps shrinking? According to Canada's Auditor General, the projected cost of the F-35 plan did not stay at 19 billion Canadian dollars. It climbed to 27.7 billion, with some estimates reaching as high as 33 billion once long-term infrastructure and support are included. Those aren't just big numbers. Those are numbers that change the conversation. This no longer looks like a routine procurement decision. It starts to feel like signing away financial flexibility for decades while someone else holds the remote. Defense analysts describe it as a paradox. Spending keeps rising, authority keeps shrinking. Every major component of the F-35 is tied into a global supply network coordinated by Lockheed Martin. Software updates pass through U.S. military approval channels, maintenance schedules, data access, and even mission systems are governed by rules written in Washington, not Ottawa. Canada pays the bill, but the keys stay somewhere else. In that environment, dear viewers, it becomes reasonable to ask uncomfortable questions. If tens of billions are already committed, why not direct that investment towards something Canada can shape and manage? If factories must be built, why should they exist only to support a foreign program? Those questions are what open the door to the scenario we're talking about tonight. Now imagine Ottawa decides the old script is no longer acceptable. Instead of purchasing all 88 F-35s, Canada turns in a different direction and signs an agreement with Sweden's Saab to produce the Gripen E inside Canada. Not imported airframes, not limited final assembly, full production backed by complete technology transfer. Engines integration, electronic warfare systems, avionics, advanced composite manufacturing moved into Canadian hands as part of a sovereign sustainment model. International observers would not call that a normal order, they would call it historic. Sweden gains a production partner in North America. Canada regains a military aviation capability that effectively disappeared after the cancellation of the CF-105 Arrow in the late 1950s. But the real shock arrives in the next clause of this hypothetical deal. Under this scenario, Canada doesn't just build Gripens for itself, it receives export rights for the aircraft to other NATO members. That single line in a contract changes everything, because suddenly Bombardier and CAE stop acting like subcontractors in someone else's program and start stepping into the role of certified defense manufacturers in their own right. And that, dear viewers, is the moment when we stop talking about a purchase and start talking about a power shift. Dear viewers, let me show you exactly why this model scares incumbents and excites strategists. In practical terms, a sovereign Gripen sustainment model could mean an Ontario factory where Canadian engineers work side by side with Saab specialists, shaping composite airframes built to NATO standards. Power plants sourced from partners Canada negotiates with directly rather than being locked into a single U.S. supplier. Radar and electronic warfare systems built on Swedish designs, but adapted and upgraded in Montreal by CAE teams. One of the most critical elements here is invisible to the eye, software. The F-35 operates as a closed system controlled by Lockheed Martin. Mission data, sensor fusion, and combat effectiveness all depend on continuous updates filtered through U.S. channels. The Gripen, by contrast, was designed around an open architecture. If Canadian forces need to modify systems for Arctic conditions or unique operational requirements, those changes can be made without sending a request letter to Washington and waiting for permission. Control of the source code stops being a technical line in a contract. It becomes a symbol of independence. But theory never unfolds without friction. If such a plan moved forward, Canada wouldn't just be adding an assembly line, it would be undertaking a transformation on a scale not seen since the Second World War. Economists estimate that a Gripen production line could generate between 15,000 and 20,000 direct jobs across engineering, specialized welding, defense software development, and systems integration. Bombardier, once a builder of Canadian military aircraft before stepping away from defense aviation, could return to a field it helped define. CAE would move from supporting supplier to full strategic partner. Pratt & Whitney Canada could explore expanding from civilian engines into military propulsion. Job creation is only the surface. Behind it sits something far more strategic, a deep, resilient, and domestically anchored supply chain. Aviation-grade aluminum, advanced composites, secure electronics, military-certified components, hundreds of small and mid-sized firms would need to upgrade to meet NATO standards. That is how you go from buyer of jets to country that shapes an entire ecosystem. Now let's look at the demand side. If Canadian-built Gripens reached operational status, who would actually buy them? Defense analysts typically point to three groups. First, Eastern European nations like Poland and Romania. They are expanding defense capabilities under real security pressure while managing limited budgets. Publicly available data suggests Gripen operating costs average around $8,000 per flight hour, compared to roughly $35,000 to $47,000 for the F-35. That difference is not a rounding error. That difference determines whether a squadron can fly often enough to matter. A Canadian-produced, NATO-certified fighter with that cost profile starts to look like a very practical answer. Second, Nordic countries interested in diversifying their supply sources. Finland, now a NATO member, has long prioritized autonomy in defense decisions. A reliable production partner in North America that isn't tied to a single U.S. contractor could appeal to policymakers looking for balance. Third, several NATO members still flying aging F-16 fleets. They want upgrades, but they don't necessarily want to commit fully to the F-35 program. A modernized Gripen option gives them a way to avoid long-term dependence on one supplier without dropping out of the Western ecosystem. Pause on that for a second. For the first time, Canada wouldn't just be deciding what it flies. It would be shaping what other countries in NATO can choose to fly as well. That is not the traditional role of a middle power focused on diplomacy and peacekeeping. That is the role of a country that quietly becomes a gatekeeper in a critical part of the alliance's force structure. So what happens in Washington if Canada steps into that role? Start with the numbers. Industry estimates suggest that selling around 200 Gripens to NATO partners over 2 decades could generate between 25 and 30 billion Canadian dollars in revenue. That revenue doesn't just pay salaries. It stabilizes advanced manufacturing, keeps high-tech talent from drifting south, and gives Ottawa leverage in trade conversations it never had before. For Lockheed Martin, that's not an abstract risk. They would be facing the loss of a $19 billion contract in Canada while watching a European competitor gain NATO market share at their expense. Lobbying efforts would follow, framed not as protecting revenue, but as preserving interoperability or protecting alliance cohesion. The Pentagon would raise concerns too. For decades, NATO's defense architecture has been built around U.S. systems, from Link 16 communications to identification friend or foe technologies. A broader mix of platforms complicates coordination. That argument is real. But here's the nuance, dear viewers. Complication is not the same as collapse. Some American strategists may quietly see advantages. If Canada shoulders more responsibility for NATO air power, U.S. resources can be redirected toward the Pacific, where strategic competition with China dominates planning. Trump might see a Canadian export line as a threat to U.S. dominance. Others in Washington might see it as a way to offload part of the European burden without saying so out loud. That's the contradiction at the heart of this. Canada building Gripens for NATO simultaneously challenges U.S. industrial dominance and potentially supports U.S. strategic priorities. Both can be true at once. Looking further ahead, a successful Canadian Gripen program would influence national identity as much as defense policy. Political economists argue that a domestic defense industry could help rebalance trade relationships with the United States. Instead of importing tens of billions in equipment, Canada could become a net exporter of advanced systems to NATO members and beyond, to partners like Australia, Singapore, or Gulf states looking for diversified suppliers. But every benefit carries its own counterweight. Ethical dilemmas appear quickly. Who receives these aircraft? Under what conditions? What happens when Canadian-built fighters show up in an active combat zone? Responsibility does not end at the factory gate. There is also the question of sustainability. Advanced fighters are not build once and forget machines. They require continuous research and development, iterative upgrades, and next generation planning. If future variants emerge, Canada would need the capacity to contribute meaningfully rather than relying entirely on foreign partners. True independence unfolds over decades, not contract cycles. Producing and exporting Gripens would do more than a just procurement strategy. It would challenge long-standing assumptions about how power, technology, and sovereignty intersect in the modern world. Dear viewers, here's the pattern that's starting to emerge. For years, the assumption was simple. Canada buys American jets, supports American programs, and accepts American rules. That pattern is now under review. When Lockheed designs a system where software and updates stay under U.S. control, it's presented as advanced integration. When Canada contemplates a platform where source code and production stay at home, it's labeled as a risk to interoperability. That's not a neutral distinction. That's a struggle over who gets to define acceptable dependence. Trump might look at a Canadian Gripen export line and think he's watching an ally drift away from American orbit. In reality, what he'd be watching is a country finally testing whether it can carry more weight inside NATO on its own terms. And the world is watching, not just Washington and Stockholm, but every country that has quietly wondered if there is an alternative to single supplier dependence. What happens when Canada goes from buyer to builder in NATO air power? The answer won't just shape its fighter fleet, it will shape how the alliance understands power, responsibility, and who gets to write the rules of the next generation. You've been watching Canada Unfiltered. If this raised more questions than it answered, that's the point, because the next decisions Ottawa makes won't just decide which jet sits on the runway. They'll decide what kind of country is sitting in the control tower.